So imagine you spend like your entire life savings building this high-tech trillion-dollar mansion.
Okay, sounds pretty nice.
Right. I mean, you import the absolute finest Italian marble, you install smart screens in every single room, and you create these perfectly climate-controlled environments.
Sounds like an absolute masterpiece.
It is. It really is. But then a massive storm hits, and suddenly you realize two incredibly terrifying things.
Uh-oh. Let me guess you forgot the roof.
Close. You realize you never put a lock on the front door, and you don't have a well in the backyard.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a serious oversight.
Exactly. So when the municipal water shuts off and the power lines go down, that trillion-dollar mansion isn't a palace anymore. It becomes this very expensive, very beautiful trap.
And right now, in April of 2026, that exact terrifying realization is sweeping across an entire region of the world.
Which is exactly what we're getting into today.
Yeah, the Gulf states are really discovering that a luxury fortress without structural independence is just waiting to be besieged.
Welcome, everyone. We are stepping right into the center of a massive, ongoing geopolitical earthquake for this deep dive, the 2026 U.S.-Israeli-Iran war.
It is a massive topic.
It is, and our lens for understanding this today is an urgent, meticulously researched paper by محمد Buheji. It's titled GCC Self-Sufficiency Necessity Lessons Learned from the U.S.-Israeli-Iran War.
And just for context, that focuses on the Gulf Cooperation Council states, right? So Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE.
Exactly. For decades, their survival strategy rested on two main pillars: immense wealth and strict neutrality. But this current conflict has completely shattered the assumption that they could just sit out a regional storm.
It really has. And before we unpack the architecture of this crisis, we need to be very clear about our mission here.
Yes, absolutely. This is important.
We are analyzing a highly charged, active geopolitical conflict. And in doing so, we are not taking sides or endorsing the political or military viewpoints of any of the actors involved, Western, Middle Eastern, or otherwise.
Right. Our goal for you, the listener, is to impartially examine the economic facts, the supply chain vulnerabilities, and the structural realities exactly as they're presented in this source material.
We are strictly looking at the ledger and the logistics.
And according to Buheji, that ledger reveals that the GCC's previous strategy of relying on external dependencies for security was, well, a fatal miscalculation.
Yeah, it was. Let's look at that first major architectural flaw in their mansion, which the paper calls the alliance trap.
The alliance trap. Okay, break that down for us.
So, the core tenet of Gulf security for half a century was the American military umbrella. The GCC hosts U.S. bases, and in return, they get a guarantee of protection.
Seems like a straightforward deal.
Right. But the mechanics of modern warfare have turned that shield into a lightning rod. The underlying logic was based on traditional state-on-state deterrence.
Meaning the mere presence of a superpower's military was supposed to freeze any regional aggression?
Exactly. But that deterrence mechanism broke down. When this 2026 conflict erupted, hosting those bases inadvertently stripped the GCC states of their neutral status.
Ah, because they are harboring a combatant's assets.
Precisely. Iran and its proxies justified missile and drone strikes on GCC's civilian and energy infrastructure by pointing directly to those U.S. military hubs.
So, I mean, it's like hiring a bodyguard whose mere presence actually provokes people to attack you.
That is a perfect way to put it. You cannot claim to be a neutral bystander when a primary combatant is launching operations from your soil. The geographic reality completely overrides the diplomatic posturing.
That brings up a fascinating geographic vulnerability, the import dependency trap.
This one is staggering.
It really is. I think most people understand the Gulf as an arid region, but the sheer scale of the caloric deficit is wild. The paper notes that 80 to 90% of their food is imported.
Which is a huge number on its own.
Right. But it's not just that they rely on outside food, it's how that food arrives. Historically, over 70% of those imports transit through a single maritime choke point.
The Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly.
When you look at a map, the Strait of Hormuz is just this incredibly narrow artery. In a state of regional war, with that strait effectively closed or severely restricted, a supply chain bottleneck becomes an immediate hunger risk.
Because a modern society can't function on just a few weeks of imported grain reserves.
Not at all. Especially when the only door to the house is bolted shut from the outside.
And, food is one thing, but water is an even faster clock, right?
No, absolutely. The GCC states rely on desalination plants for 50 to 90% of their fresh water.
And these aren't small hidden facilities either. They are massive, energy-intensive industrial complexes.
Right, with huge footprints right there on the coastline. Because they are so highly concentrated, They represent massive single points of failure.
Like the recent attacks on facilities in Bahrain and Iran.
Exactly. Those attacks demonstrate that if you knock out just a few key nodes, the region literally becomes uninhabitable in days. Adversaries are fully aware of this fragility.
Which really exposes the limitation of the GCC's approach to defense. I want to push back on this a bit, though. These countries are among the biggest arms importers in the world. If they spend billions on defense, why are they so vulnerable?
That is the million-dollar question, or, well, the billion-dollar question. Buheji calls this the imported weaponry trap. Yes, they possess incredibly sophisticated air defense networks.
Right.
Yet, the current conflict is exposing the asymmetrical math of modern warfare.
Walk me through that math.
Imagine firing a highly sophisticated interceptor missile, which might cost $2 or $3 million to manufacture and import.
Okay.
And you fire that just to shoot down a mass-produced loitering munition, a drone, that costs maybe $20,000.
Oh, wow. Yeah, if you do that, you are going to bankrupt yourself before you ever run out of targets.
Exactly. That asymmetric cost curve is financially unsustainable. Plus, imported weapons require foreign maintenance contracts, proprietary spare parts, continuous software upgrades.
So if global supply chains fracture or a supplier imposes an embargo,
those billion-dollar air defense batteries become completely useless. Security is just an illusion if you lack the autonomous industrial capacity to actually maintain the systems protecting your airspace.
Okay, so if the physical security umbrella has collapsed and the logistical supply lines are choked off, what happens when we look at the actual ledger?
The quantifiable cost of this storm is brutal.
It is. Moving from strategic theory to the immediate economic reality, the UN Development Program estimates cited in the paper show that the first month of the conflict alone cost the Arab region approximately $186 billion.
Just let that sink in. $186 billion. That figure represents a 6% contraction in regional GDP in just 4 weeks.
Which is insane.
Yeah.
We have to translate that macroeconomic shock into human terms, right?
We do. That is 4 million people pushed into poverty and 3.7 million jobs instantly wiped out.
And that's just the first month.
Right. If we stretch the timeline based on Oxford economics projections, a 6-month war could reduce GCC GDP by 15 to 20%.
Oh my.
Yeah, that pushes the economic losses comfortably past the $1 trillion mark.
To really internalize the severity of a 6% GDP drop in a single month, I want you, the listener, to look back at the global economic freeze of 2020.
That is a great comparison.
Right. That entire year of pandemic lockdowns caused global GDP to drop by roughly 3%. The GCC just experienced double that economic destruction in a fraction of the time.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
But wait, let's look at their financial reserves. The GCC has an estimated $4.9 trillion sitting in sovereign wealth funds. They are historically incredibly wealthy. Can't they just buy their way out of a supply chain collapse?
You would think so, but no.
Yeah.
Because capital cannot rewrite physical geography.
Meaning?
Financial wealth is an abstract tool. It completely loses its utility when physical logistics collapse. You cannot consume currency.
Right. You can't eat a stack of $100 bills.
Exactly. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed to commercial shipping, $1 trillion in a sovereign wealth fund does not magically bypass a naval blockade to deliver a cargo ship full of wheat.
That makes sense.
And this realization triggers a secondary economic shock mechanism known as investment flight.
Ah, because the Gulf spent decades meticulously building a brand as the singular safe haven of the Middle East.
Yes. They position themselves as the stable, reliable place to build regional headquarters, park capital, host global events.
And that brand relies entirely on the perception of total security.
Exactly. Once missiles cross the airspace, the risk calculus for global capital changes overnight. War risk insurance premiums for commercial vessels operating in Gulf waters spiked from 0.25% to as high as 10%.
Wow, from 0.25 to 10%. That completely erases the profit margins for shipping goods.
It does. Additionally, the closure of the strait removed 11 million barrels of oil per day from global supply.
Which means their primary revenue engine is choked off at the exact moment. Their economic diversification strategies like aviation and tourism are collapsing. I read that 50,000 Gulf flights were canceled.
It's a complete shutdown. Passive wealth fails when the physical world stops moving.
So knowing that, how do they actually restructure? Because the paper doesn't just list the problems, right? It proposes a comprehensive framework for surviving this new reality.
It does. Buheji outlines 3 states of autonomy: dependency, independence, and interdependency.
Okay, let's break those down. Dependency is obvious.
Right. Dependency is the architecture that just failed them, relying almost entirely on asymmetric external forces for security and baseline survival.
So the instinctive reaction to that failure might be to swing the pendulum all the way to complete independence.
But in macroeconomic terms, independence basically means autarky. It means closing your borders, producing everything domestically regardless of cost, and refusing to rely on anyone.
Which is economically irrational. I mean, you completely abandon the concept of comparative advantage. If you try to grow every single crop and manufacture every single microchip in a literal desert, the inefficiency will destroy your economy faster than a blockade.
Precisely. You can't do it all. The sustainable objective, the state they actually must achieve, is interdependency.
Interdependent.
Yes, this is a state of mutual reliance. You still engage in global trade, but you build in enough redundant systems, alternative trade routes, and baseline indigenous manufacturing capacity that no single severed relationship or blocked choke point can cause a systemic collapse.
It functions exactly like a well-diversified institutional investment portfolio.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
If your entire net worth is tied up in one volatile tech stock, that's dependency. When the stock crashes, you are ruined.
Right.
If you hide all your cash under a mattress, that's autarky or independence, and inflation just eats you alive.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you diversify across global equities, real estate, and bonds, that's interdependency. One market crash hurts, but it doesn't bankrupt you.
That portfolio theory applies perfectly to national sovereignty. And the paper supports this with comparative case studies. Take Syria after the 2011 uprisings.
Okay.
They were deeply reliant on external aid and concentrated global supply chains. When those external links fractured, the nation lacked the internal mechanisms to absorb the shock.
Leading to catastrophic systemic failure and widespread famine.
Exactly. Now compare that to Rwanda in the aftermath of 1994.
Right. Following the genocide, Rwanda's infrastructure was completely devastated.
But they pursued a very deliberate structural rebuild. They recognized the danger of remaining purely reliant on international aid.
So what did they do?
They aggressively invested in indigenous agricultural cooperatives, digitized their economy with mobile money and widespread broadband, basically leapfrogging traditional banking constraints.
Yeah.
And they heavily prioritized national cohesion.
And today, Rwanda can weather global supply chain shocks that absolutely paralyze its more aid-dependent neighbors.
Exactly. Precisely because they built interdependent resilience.
The blueprint worked for Rwanda, but practically speaking, how do you apply that model to the arid, hypermodern Gulf? How do you diversify your entire country's survival when you live in a desert climate?
It requires a highly specific architectural shift. Buheji lays out an actionable $300 billion master plan over the next decade.
Okay, let's get into the blueprint. He breaks it down into 3 pillars. Let's start with pillar 1, food and water.
Right. Currently, the strategic grain reserves in the GCC might cover 3 to 6 months. The plan mandates stretching that buffer to 12 to 18 months.
Which makes sense. But the geographic placement of those reserves is the actual innovation here, isn't it?
It is. The paper points to the UAE's Fujairah silos as the model to replicate.
Why Fujairah?
Because it's strategically located on the eastern seaboard of the UAE, facing the Gulf of Oman and the Indian Ocean. It completely bypasses the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh, wow. So even if the Persian Gulf is completely locked down, ships can still dock and unload grain on the Indian Ocean coast.
Exactly. You completely redraw the logistics map.
You essentially move the emergency generator out of the basement that always floods.
That's exactly it. They also emphasize vertical farming and advanced hydroponics to reduce agricultural water usage.
But regarding actual drinking water, we established earlier that massive desalination plants are huge vulnerabilities. If the goal is resilience, they have to abandon that mega project model, right?
They do. They need to shift toward a mesh network, a decentralized grid approach.
How's that work?
Buheji highlights Israel's water strategy as a benchmark. Instead of constructing a handful of enormous, highly visible thermal desalination plants, the strategy shifts toward building hundreds of smaller, modular reverse osmosis facilities.
Just distributed everywhere.
Yeah, distributed across the entire coastline and inland.
Because in a mesh network, it's like avoiding the Death Star flaw. You don't put all your critical infrastructure in one exhaust port.
Right. If a drone strike takes out one local facility, you only lose like 2% of your grid capacity.
And the surrounding nodes can dynamically reroute water to cover the deficit. You eliminate the single point of catastrophic failure.
Exactly. So that covers food and water. Pillar 2 addresses the imported weaponry trap we talked about, defense.
Okay, what's the plan there?
The core directive is that the GCC must transition from being the world's biggest buyer of arms to an active seller and manufacturer.
That is a fundamental industrial pivot.
It is. They cannot afford to rely on imported kinetic interceptors. The blueprint requires massive indigenous investment in manufacturing autonomous systems, specifically building their own drone fleets and countermeasure technologies.
But more importantly, they must dominate electronic warfare.
Yes, because the most cost-effective way to stop a swarm of cheap drones isn't to shoot them down with missiles.
Right, it's to fry their navigation circuits with directed energy or jam their frequencies so they just drop out of the sky.
And they need to own the intellectual property and the domestic assembly lines for those exact jamming systems.
That makes total sense. All right, what about Pillar 3?
Pillar 3 tackles the foundational layer holding all of this together, the economy and finance. The geopolitical events of the 2020s proved that financial networks can be weaponized just as effectively as airspace.
So true. The paper explicitly warns about the dangers of relying entirely on the SWIFT banking system and dollar-denominated trade.
Because SWIFT is essentially the global messaging system that banks use to clear cross-border transactions.
Right, and since it is highly centralized and heavily influenced by Western powers, a nation can literally have its bank codes turned off overnight,
Instantly freezing them out of global trade.
So how does the paper suggest they bypass that?
By operationalizing bilateral currency swaps with massive trading partners like China, India, and Russia.
Which means what, practically?
A bilateral swap allows two central banks to exchange their local currencies directly at predetermined rates. It completely bypasses the need to convert through the US dollar or route the transaction through Western clearinghouses.
Oh, that's huge. And the paper also advocates for central bank digital currencies, right? CBDCs.
Yes, the widespread implementation of CBDCs among the GCC states themselves.
So they are basically building an alternate digital highway for capital.
Exactly. If the traditional banking corridors are sanctioned or frozen, the CBDCs allow trade and capital to continue flowing seamlessly within the Gulf.
Brilliant. And on the physical side of Pillar 3, the paper mandates localized manufacturing of active pharmaceutical ingredients and critical medical supplies.
Qatar actually provided the proof of concept for this during their 2017 diplomatic crisis.
Right, when they rapidly pivoted to manufacturing their own personal protective equipment and essential goods to survive that blockade.
Exactly. But we have to address the financial reality of this entire blueprint.
Right, because building a domestic defense industry, a decentralized water grid, an advanced agritech sector, and a parallel financial system from scratch, I mean, that sounds insanely expensive. Is this actually realistic?
The paper estimates this will require an investment of $200 to $300 billion spread out over a decade.
That is a staggering price tag.
It sounds like it, but let's look at the macroeconomic reality. They lost $186 billion in just the first month of the 2026 war.
Oh, wow. Put like that.
Yeah, the cost-benefit analysis is unequivocally clear. One major regional conflict costs as much as a decade of comprehensive self-sufficiency investment.
And furthermore, committing that $200 to $300 billion locally creates a profound macroeconomic multiplier effect.
It does. Currently, defense and food budgets are exported. Billions leave the region to pay foreign defense contractors and foreign agriculture megacorporations.
So by domesticating those industries, they inject that capital directly into their own economy.
It transitions the GCC from a purely consumption-based economy to a production-based economy.
And that domestic investment generates the exact type of high-skill economic activity needed to replace the 3.7 million jobs lost to the conflict.
The math and the blueprints are structurally sound, but executing a master plan of this scale requires navigating deeply entrenched societal roadblocks.
Which brings us to the final challenge. Overcoming internal barriers. The math is undeniable, but a blueprint is only as good as the builders. What is actually stopping the GCC from executing this plan tomorrow?
The paper identifies three primary hurdles. The first is coordination failures. The GCC is not, a monolithic, perfectly harmonious entity.
Historically, they have definitely fractured over strategic differences. Like you mentioned, the 2017 blockade saw several GCC states actively impose embargoes on Qatar, a fellow member.
Right. And to execute a regional mesh network for water or a shared digital currency, you need absolute trust.
Which hasn't always been there.
Exactly. The paper argues they must establish a standing GCC crisis council with binding, overriding authority over national food, water, and defense strategies.
Because without ironclad institutional coordination, this blueprint just fractures into 6 separate, incredibly inefficient national vanity projects.
Precisely. The second massive barrier is the labor and skills gap.
Right, because you cannot decree an advanced electronic warfare industry or an AI-driven vertical farming sector into existence if you don't have the human capital to actually engineer it.
And currently, the Gulf relies heavily on expatriate talent to run its technical sectors. They face a critical shortage of indigenous STEM expertise.
So what's the fix?
The blueprint requires a radical redirection of their educational pipelines, plus aggressive, targeted incentive structures to attract diaspora talent engineers and scientists who left the region back home to lead these new strategic industries.
Which flows directly into the third and arguably most difficult barrier, the rentier trap.
Yes, this is a deeply ingrained sociological issue.
For decades, the social contract in the Gulf operated on a very specific dynamic. The state extracted immense wealth from oil exports, and in return, it provided citizens with incredibly comfortable public sector jobs, massive subsidies, zero income tax, and total security.
It creates a framework based entirely on wealth distribution rather than wealth creation.
It's kind of like a group project where everyone is used to just paying the rich kid to do all the work. But suddenly, the teacher says everyone has to present.
That's a great analogy. It's like a trust fund that pays out just enough to keep you perfectly comfortable, but actively removes any incentive for you to learn how to generate your own wealth or develop hard skills.
So when the trust fund suddenly dries up, or in this case, when the external security guarantees fail, you don't just lack resources. You lack the technical skills and the psychological resilience to go out and build a functional enterprise.
Exactly. Expecting citizens to voluntarily surrender comfortable, guaranteed public sector sinecures to do the grueling, high-risk work of building domestic defense and agri-tech sectors, that is a profoundly painful renegotiation of the social contract.
Will the populations actually accept this shift? I mean, it is a massive disruption to their entire way of life.
The paper makes a compelling argument here. Buheji argues that the trauma of the 2026 conflict has fundamentally altered the psychological landscape.
How so?
The shared experience of vulnerability, the missiles impacting infrastructure, the immediate fear of supply chains halting, it has created an unprecedented narrow window of political will.
It is no longer a debate about whether citizens want to change their lifestyle.
Exactly. The physical collapse of their external dependencies is forcing the adaptation. The old social contract is defunct because the security it promised turned out to be an illusion.
They are really looking at a fundamental rewiring of not just their macroeconomic structure, but their entire societal identity.
As we pull all these threads together for you, the listener, the ultimate stakes of this transition really become clear.
Yeah, the GCC is facing a stark binary choice here.
The first option is to attempt to return to the pre-war status quo, right? Remaining heavily dependent on external powers for survival and just accepting that they will suffer devastating economic hemorrhages, hundreds of billions of dollars lost every single time geopolitical tensions in the Middle East escalate.
Or the second option, commit $200 to $300 billion over the next decade to engineer true interdependency.
They build 18 months of secure food reserves outside the naval choke points.
They construct decentralized, highly resilient mesh networks for water.
They manufacture their own directed energy defense systems.
And they establish independent digital currency corridors that cannot be switched off by a foreign central bank.
Because the ultimate lesson of this conflict is that true security cannot be purchased off the shelf from a foreign supplier. It must be structurally integrated into the fabric of the nation itself.
And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to explore on your own. Buheji notes that if this comprehensive transformation succeeds, it will elevate the GCC from a dependent energy province into a genuinely self-reliant regional power.
It completely changes the map.
It does. So ask yourself this. If the Gulf states successfully execute this blueprint, if they permanently secure their own food and water, control their own autonomous defense manufacturing, and route their capital through their own digital corridors, how dramatically does that shift the entire global balance of power?
That is the real question.
For the last 50 years, Western nations have operated on the assumption that the GCC would always remain dependent on them for survival. What happens to global diplomacy and economic leverage when that trillion-dollar mansion finally installs its own locks, digs its own well, and no longer needs the outside world to keep the lights on?
That is the question that will likely redefine the geopolitical architecture of the 21st century.
Thank you for taking this deep dive into the source material with us today. Stay curious, keep questioning the structures around you, and we'll catch you on the next one.